When 26-year-old Karoline Leavitt stood before a judge in a packed courtroom, she didn't expect to make history. She only expected to defend her rights. But when a seemingly routine hearing ended with an unexpected fine and a sharp rebuke, Karoline's quiet determination triggered a chain of events no one could have predicted. What began as a moment of public humiliation turned into a courtroom revelation that would ripple far beyond those four walls. Because the judge who underestimated her was about to learn something surprising. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just another citizen defending herself. She was a legal prodigy in disguise. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a courthouse where things were supposed to go by the book. The courtroom was cold, colder than Karoline expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. The air carried that tense stillness only found in rooms where judgment hangs heavy, where people fidget with nervous hands and clear throats that suddenly feel dry. Karoline sat in the second row, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Her blazer, a simple navy one she'd worn during college debate finals, was neatly pressed. She had brushed her hair into a low bun that morning, not for style, but for seriousness. She wasn't here to impress. She was here to be heard. At the front of the room, Judge Walter Hargrove scanned the docket through thin reading glasses that rested halfway down his nose. A veteran of the bench, Hargrove was known for his precision, his no-nonsense rulings, and a stare that could quiet even the boldest attorney. He didn't notice Karoline when she walked in, or if he did, he gave no sign. To him, she was just another name in a long list of minor infractions that cluttered his Tuesday calendar. Case 204. Leavitt, Karoline. The clerk called her name, and Karoline rose, walking steadily to the defendant's table. She didn't shuffle or fumble or avert her eyes. She met the judge's gaze with quiet confidence, a hint of steel beneath her calm. "Miss Leavitt," Judge Hargrove began without looking up, "you've been cited for obstruction during a public hearing and failure to comply with procedural decorum." Karoline opened her mouth to respond, but the judge raised a hand. "This isn't a debate, Miss Leavitt. You'll have a chance to speak after I review the record." Karoline closed her lips, offering a small nod. Inside, she was already forming her thoughts, mentally filing constitutional references and procedural precedents like index cards in a well-worn drawer. She wasn't nervous, not because she didn't respect the court, but because she respected herself, her education, her preparation, and the truth of what had actually happened, what the record didn't show. Judge Hargrove skimmed the summary. The citation accused Karoline of disrupting a town zoning board meeting 2 weeks prior. According to the officer's report, she had spoken out of turn, challenged the board's authority, and refused to yield the floor. She had not been belligerent, but she had been insistent. Too insistent, it seemed, for the small-town politics that preferred silence over scrutiny. "Do you contest the charges, Miss Leavitt?" the judge asked. Karoline stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." The judge finally looked at her. Really looked. She was young. Too young, in his opinion, to be this sure of herself. He'd seen enough eager law students try to play courtroom hero over the years, quoting textbooks and misapplying logic. Most left with less pride than they entered with. He assumed this would be no different. "You may proceed," he said, leaning back in his chair. Karoline took a breath, not because she was nervous, but because words matter, and hers had always been chosen carefully. "Your Honor, at the zoning board meeting in question, I was granted the floor during the public comment period. I spoke within the allotted time, and I remained seated when directed. My objection arose not from defiance, but from the board's sudden vote to close comments without notice, cutting off public input on a proposed development that would affect dozens of families, including my own." Judge Hargrove raised an eyebrow. "I cited municipal code," Karoline continued, "which clearly states that if a public hearing is to be closed prematurely, a unanimous vote must be recorded. No such vote occurred. I simply asked for clarification. Twice. I was told to leave. When I asked under what authority, the board called security. She held up a folder, neatly tabbed with printed copies of the zoning bylaws, a transcript of the meeting, and a highlighted section of the local charter. The judge motioned for the bailiff to retrieve it. He flipped through the pages quickly, scanning her notes. His brow furrowed. Karoline remained silent. Not smug, not defensive. Just still. It was the stillness of someone who knew she was right, but didn't need to prove it to feel whole. Her argument was never about ego. It was about principle. After a long pause, the judge sighed. Regardless of your intent, Miss Leavitt, it's not the citizen's job to enforce procedure. That's for the board to manage. With respect, Your Honor, Karoline replied evenly. When procedure fails the public, it becomes the citizen's responsibility to speak up. That's the foundation of participatory democracy. We don't lose our rights at the microphone. There was a hush in the courtroom. The woman in the back row, waiting for her parking citation to be called, leaned forward. The man beside her, who'd spent the last 5 minutes scrolling through his phone, suddenly looked up. Judge Hargrove said nothing. He simply stared at Karoline, his expression unreadable. He issued a small fine, $100, citing disruption of order, but waived all additional penalties. He didn't look at her again as he banged the gavel. Case closed. Karoline collected her folder, thanked the judge, and walked out the way she came in, straight-backed, clear-eyed, with her dignity fully intact. She had lost the battle, but the judge had felt something shift. He didn't know her, not yet, but he would, because somewhere in that cold courtroom, a spark had caught flame, and Karoline Leavitt had only just begun. Back in his chambers, Judge Walter Hargrove removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, the way he always did when something didn't sit quite right. The courtroom had been cleared, his docket nearly finished for the day, but Karoline Leavitt's name kept echoing in his mind, refusing to fade with the rest of the morning's routine cases. He reached for the case file again, flipping it open as if maybe he'd missed something. Her words still lingered in the air, measured, articulate, brimming with clarity and something more difficult to name. Not arrogance, not defiance, conviction. That was it. Hargrove had seen hundreds of self-represented defendants over the years. Most stumbled through their statements, fumbling legal jargon, and losing their footing the moment things turned formal. But this young woman, this Karoline, had handled herself like someone who not only understood the law, but respected it enough to use it properly. Her tone had been sharp but respectful, her logic tight, her citations accurate. He had checked them while she spoke. He stared down at her name on the docket again. Leavitt, Karoline. It nagged at him. The surname wasn't uncommon in New England, but it triggered something. A memory just out of reach, like a face at the edge of a dream. He'd heard it before. Somewhere in the context of politics, or maybe academia. He wasn't sure. He opened his laptop and typed the name into a search bar. The first result was a Wikipedia page. Karoline Leavitt, former White House Assistant Press Secretary, congressional candidate, political strategist, and media analyst. The judge blinked. He clicked. The profile unfolded like a quiet thunderclap. Graduated early, communications degree, magna cum laude. Youngest woman to ever run for Congress, national TV appearances, policy analyst, political consultant, speeches at universities, guest columns in major newspapers, and now, apparently, a defendant in his courtroom for what amounted to an overzealous zoning board fine. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose, the way people do when they realize they've underestimated someone badly. A clerk knocked gently on the door. "Everything all right, Your Honor?" He closed the laptop slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice thoughtful. just finishing up. But he wasn't. Not really. Because now that he knew who she was, things looked different. That girl in the navy blazer hadn't been trying to prove herself. She'd been restraining herself, holding back. And she still managed to make him pause, which few ever did. He remembered how she stood, not hunched or trembling, but grounded, like someone who had practiced strength long before anyone had given her permission to use it. She didn't need theatrics or attitude. She had facts, principle, and that rarest of courtroom qualities, grace under pressure. The judge stared at the file on his desk for a long moment, then slid it aside. He reached for a yellow legal pad and began to write. Not notes on her case, but on his own thoughts. A habit he'd developed early in his judicial career. Quiet reflections for himself, never shared. Karoline Leavitt, poised, articulate, not here to make a scene, here to be heard. Spoke with fluency in law, not arrogance. Should not have been fined, but couldn't risk letting her off entirely without scrutiny. Was I too quick to dismiss her? He tapped his pen against the desk. Most people came and went through his courtroom unnoticed. A blur of minor offenses, routine hearings, apologies rehearsed and forgotten. But this one was different. She hadn't just defended herself, she had defended a principle, calmly, powerfully, unapologetically. He picked up the file again and jotted a small note in the corner. Keep an eye on this one. In another office across town, Karoline sat at a small desk in her apartment, sipping black coffee and reviewing emails. She didn't know the judge was Googling her, didn't know he'd started a file in his mind titled, "The One I Nearly Missed." She just knew she'd told the truth and stood her ground, and she had done it without raising her voice. Because when you know the law and yourself, you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to show up, prepared, and let your name do the rest. And sometimes, that name rings louder than any gavel. Rain fell in a soft drizzle outside the courthouse, tapping gently against the high windows like a polite reminder that the world kept turning, regardless of what happened inside. Karoline stood just beyond the courthouse steps, sheltering under the modest overhang, a thin manila envelope clutched in one hand. Inside it, the printed judgment, the fine, the words she already knew by heart. She didn't move for a long time. People passed her, lawyers with briefcases, defendants with cigarettes and hurried phone calls, court staff rushing to beat the weather to their cars. No one gave her a second glance. And that was fine. That was familiar. Karoline had grown used to being overlooked until it was too late to ignore her. But this fine, it wasn't about money. $100 wasn't going to break her. What lingered, stung and burned at the edges was what it represented. Not just a penalty, but a verdict on her character. A reprimand dressed up in legal language, handed down like a school teacher's warning. Disruption of order, failure to comply. As if passion for due process were disorder. As if standing firm, calmly and without insult, was somehow an offense. She had been fine with walking out of that zoning board meeting with a citation. She hadn't gone there expecting to be welcomed. But the courtroom, that was supposed to be the place where reason triumphed over ego. And yet, there she was, fined not because she was wrong, but because her correctness had made someone uncomfortable. Karoline blinked up at the gray sky, a drop catching the edge of her lashes. She hadn't expected a standing ovation, but she had expected the law to be the law. Back home, she peeled off her rain-damp blazer, hung it over the back of her chair, and set the envelope on the small dining table she used as a desk. Her apartment was modest. Brick walls, a kitchen that doubled as an entryway, and books everywhere. Shelves bowed under the weight of old legal texts, political biographies, and copies of the U.S. Constitution in every format. Annotated, illustrated, pocket-sized, and hardbound. Karoline sat down and reread the judgment. Then she turned to her laptop, pulling up the municipal code again. She hadn't missed anything. Section 12, Article 4, Public Comment Period. Procedures, voting requirements, notification rules. All of it was there. She had followed the rules. The board had not. And she had been fined anyway. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wasn't sure what she was doing yet. Writing an appeal, drafting a letter, or just capturing the ache in her chest so it wouldn't weigh her down in silence. Maybe she was writing to remind herself that truth didn't stop being true just because someone refused to acknowledge it. The fine was procedural, not personal, she typed, but the message was clear. Know your place. She paused, deleted it, typed again. When the rules fail to serve the people must remind the rules who they exist for. That felt better. That felt like her. As the hours passed, the room grew darker, the screen of her laptop glowing like a lighthouse in the storm. She wasn't trying to be dramatic. She hated drama. She loved rules, structure, logic. She believed deeply in the systems that held up society. But she also knew those systems only worked when ordinary people were brave enough to challenge them when they strayed. She stared at the judgment one more time. $100. To them, it was a slap on the wrist. To her, it was something else entirely. A challenge, a gauntlet, a dare. She closed the laptop, the echo of the click sounding louder than expected in the quiet apartment. Then she stood, crossed to the bookshelf, and pulled down a worn copy of the Federalist Papers. Not because she needed to reference it, but because it reminded her where power really came from. The people, not the podium. She was done feeling silenced, done feeling like her knowledge was a threat, done pretending the fine didn't matter. Because it did. Not for what it cost, but for what it tried to cost her. Her voice, her confidence, her right to question authority. Karoline slid the envelope into a folder labeled Active Cases. Then, she grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and wrote across the top in block letters. Appeal. If they thought a $100 fine would teach her a lesson, they were right. But it wasn't the one they intended. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gavel slam, no outburst, no flurry of raised voices. Just a silence. A dense, expectant kind of silence that filled the courtroom like fog. And then Karoline spoke. Her voice was even, low but clear, as though each word had been carved from stone and polished before being placed. She didn't raise her tone, didn't rush, didn't hesitate. The room, which had moments earlier hummed with the quiet shuffle of papers and the faint echo of a humming air vent, went still. I don't believe it's out of line, she said, addressing the bench, to expect public officials to follow the rules they impose on others. The judge looked up from the file in front of him, one brow lifted. The gallery behind her, mostly filled with people waiting their turn for cases far more mundane, shifted slightly. One man who had been half dozing perked up. Karoline stood at the defendant's table, her hands resting lightly on its edge. She hadn't asked permission to speak again. She simply had. Her words weren't showy. There were no clever quips, no sweeping flourishes, just the law. The way it was written, the way it had been ignored. When a citizen exercises their right to comment on matters that affect their home, their street, their family, she continued, and is silenced for pointing out a violation of procedure, what exactly are we upholding in that moment? Order or avoidance? Her tone didn't change, not even when the judge opened his mouth to interrupt. She didn't push through him. She paused, waited, gave the respect the court demanded, but her eyes, sharp and steady, never wavered. I'm not trying to cause trouble, Your Honor, she said. I'm trying to remind the system it belongs to us. There was no drama in it, But something had shifted. The way air changes just before a summer storm. Not violent yet, but thick with pressure. One clerk leaned toward another and whispered, "Who is she?" The judge didn't answer right away. He simply studied her. Karoline didn't fidget or shrink beneath the weight of that scrutiny. She had done her reading. She had reviewed the minutes from that zoning board meeting twice, then again with a red pen. She had annotated municipal codes until they bled highlighter ink. She had cross-referenced court decisions, historical precedents, and case law summaries until the argument in her mind was as clear and precise as a blueprint. She wasn't here to guess. She was here because she knew, and it showed. The bailiff at the door watched her, his usual boredom replaced by something else. Maybe curiosity, maybe admiration. Judge Hargrove sat back, arms crossed, the fine already issued but now looking slightly out of place on the desk before him, like a conclusion written before the last paragraph. He cleared his throat. "You believe the board violated its own process?" "Yes, sir," Karoline replied. They moved to vote without a procedural close of comment. The law doesn't make that optional. "And you believe that makes your continued interruption acceptable?" Karoline tilted her head slightly. Not defiant, just considering. "I believe it makes my question necessary. If public comment is only welcome when it's convenient, it's not really public comment, is it?" A ripple passed through the courtroom. Someone whispered, "She's got a point." Her tone didn't change. Not even when the judge opened his mouth to interrupt. She didn't push through him. She paused, waited, gave the respect the court demanded. But her eyes, sharp and steady, never wavered. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, Your Honor," she said. "I'm trying to remind the system it belongs to us." There was no drama in it. But something had shifted. The way air changes just before a summer storm, not violent yet, but thick with pressure. One clerk leaned toward another and whispered, "Who is she?" The judge didn't answer right away. He simply studied her. Karoline didn't fidget or shrink beneath the weight of that scrutiny. She had done her reading. She had reviewed the minutes from that zoning board meeting twice, then again with a red pen. She had annotated municipal codes until they bled highlighter ink. She had cross-referenced court decisions, historical precedents, and case law summaries until the argument in her mind was as clear and precise as a blueprint. She wasn't here to guess. She was here because she knew, and it showed. The bailiff at the door watched her, his usual boredom replaced by something else. Maybe curiosity, maybe admiration. Judge Hargrove sat back, arms crossed, the fine already issued but now looking slightly out of place on the desk before him, like a conclusion written before the last paragraph. He cleared his throat. "You believe the board violated its own process?" "Yes, sir," Karoline replied. They moved to vote without a procedural close of comment. The law doesn't make that optional. "And you believe that makes your continued interruption acceptable?" Karoline tilted her head slightly. Not defiant, just considering. "I believe it makes my question necessary. If public comment is only welcome when it's convenient, it's not really public comment, is it?" A ripple passed through the courtroom. Someone whispered, "She's got a point." He never let her win out of kindness. If she won, it was because she'd earned it, dug into logic, stood her ground, and refused to be swayed by volume or emotion alone. There were no participation trophies at that table, just steel sharpening steel. She didn't grow up with wealth, but she did grow up with expectation. Her parents both worked long hours, her mother at the local hospital, her father managing deliveries at the hardware store. Karoline learned early that if she wanted something, respect, attention, even a bigger piece of chicken, she had to make a case for it. So she did. By age 11, she was writing out pros and cons lists before making decisions. By 13, she was quoting historical speeches during school presentations. By 15, she had memorized portions of the Constitution, not for class, but because she was curious. She liked knowing where the lines were drawn. She liked knowing who had the right to speak and who was told to be quiet. Her grandfather encouraged it all. He gave her thick law books when other kids were getting jewelry or electronics. He took her to public hearings just to watch the process unfold and whispered questions in her ear while bureaucrats fumbled their lines. What did that speaker miss? Did the board actually answer the question? Do you think anyone in the room really understood what just happened? She always had an answer. And over time, her answers became clearer, cleaner, stronger. But grit wasn't just taught at the table. It was lived in the silences between her parents' shifts, in the car rides to school when the heat barely worked, in the quiet dignity her mother carried when a patient shouted at her in pain, and she never raised her voice in return. Karoline watched it all, absorbed it, and somewhere along the way, she decided that dignity didn't come from money or clothes or titles. It came from how you stood when someone tried to knock you down, from whether your voice stayed steady when someone in power tried to silence you. Debate and grit. That was the blend that shaped her. Not aggression, not rebellion. Discipline, resilience, truth, carried like a tool. Not a weapon, but not a toy either. By the time she entered her late teens, Karoline was known around town as the girl with the questions. Not in the annoying, always hand-raised kind of way, but the kind that made adults shift in their seats. She'd ask how tax money was being spent, why certain roads never got plowed in winter, why a new development was approved without a traffic study. She didn't ask to be provoked. She asked because silence had never once moved the needle forward. One winter afternoon, when Karoline was 17, she stood before the town's select board and delivered a 3-minute statement about a budget discrepancy she'd found buried in the line items of the annual report. She wasn't even old enough to vote. But when she finished, the room clapped. Her grandfather, who was sitting in the back with his arms crossed and a proud smirk on his face, said only 4 words when they walked out. "You're ready for more." And she was. Because some people learn the law from textbooks and lectures. Karoline Leavitt learned it across mashed potatoes, over the click of a ballpoint pen on a kitchen table, in a house where arguments were art, and every word mattered. By the time she stood in front of that judge years later, she wasn't improvising. She was returning to the courtroom her grandfather had built for her long ago, one dinner-time debate at a time. The last time Karoline saw her grandfather alive, he was sitting in his usual spot on the porch, a thick blanket over his knees, a steaming mug of black coffee balanced on the armrest. The sky behind him was soft with October light, trees wearing their brightest oranges and reds like a final hurrah before winter came to tuck them in. He looked smaller than she remembered, thinner around the shoulders, quieter in his movement, but the eyes were the same, sharp, watchful, a little amused, like he saw something most people didn't. He beckoned her over without speaking, just a nod and the familiar tilt of his chin. Karoline stepped onto the porch and sat beside him, tucking her legs up underneath her and pulling her hoodie tighter against the chill. They sat like that for a while, listening to the wind rustle through the trees and the occasional bird calling from somewhere deeper in the woods. "Cold enough for you?" he finally asked, his voice sandpaper but warm. Karoline smiled. "Brisk, just the way you like it." He chuckled, coughing a little. "Better than heat that makes your brain sweat. You can't think when you're too warm." She didn't answer. She just looked at him, taking in the lines around his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cup. She knew he was slipping. The doctors had said as much. But sitting next to him like that, wrapped in porch light and autumn air, she didn't want to believe it. "Are you still asking the tough questions?" he asked after a long pause. "Always." He nodded, approving. "Good. Keep doing that. The world's full of people who'll tell you to sit down, not many who'll remind you it's your seat too." Karoline looked out over the yard, where the leaves had begun to pile in thick, colorful drifts. "Sometimes it feels like they're not even listening." He sipped his coffee. "Doesn't matter if they're listening. Matters what you're saying." He set the mug down carefully, then leaned back in his chair, letting it creak beneath his weight. "You remember that time you asked your school principal why there weren't more books about women in history class?" Karoline smiled. "I was 12. He sent a note home." "He sure did." Her grandfather laughed. "Your mother nearly burst a blood vessel. But I remember thinking, that girl is going to change things someday." She glanced at him. "Did I?" "Not yet," he said, eyes twinkling. "But you're on your way." Then he grew serious, the laughter fading from his face like sunlight slipping behind a cloud. "Karoline, there's something I want you to understand. Something most people don't learn until it's too late." She turned to face him fully, sensing the weight in his voice. "The law is a tool, like a hammer. It can build a house or bash in a window. Depends on who's holding it." She nodded slowly. "And power?" he continued. "Power's a funny thing. Most people think it lives in titles or money or the corner office. But real power, the kind that lasts, lives in knowledge, in persistence, in the courage to speak when it's easier to stay quiet." He looked out at the trees again, his voice softer now. "You've got all three, Karoline. The knowledge, the grit, and the voice. That's rare. That's dangerous to people who'd rather things stay the way they are." She didn't say anything, just listened. "So when the day comes, and it will come, when someone tells you you're too young, too loud, too bold, you remember who raised you." Karoline swallowed hard. "I will." They didn't talk much more after that, just sat in the porch light until the wind grew colder and the first stars began to flicker above the trees. He passed away 3 weeks later. At the funeral, Karoline didn't cry, not until she was alone. She stood beside the closed casket, hand on the polished wood, and whispered, "I'll make you proud." And she meant it, every word, because everything she was, her command of language, her belief in justice, her unwillingness to fold under pressure, it had come from him. From that porch, from years of quiet lessons disguised as casual conversations. He had taught her how to argue without cruelty, how to listen without surrender, how to speak without apology. And when she stood before that judge not long after, fined for daring to demand fairness, she didn't flinch. She remembered her grandfather's words, and she used the law like a tool, not to destroy, but to build the kind of world he believed she could help shape. On her third trip to the courthouse, Karoline passed through security with the same calm she wore like a second skin. She didn't flinch at the metal detector's beep or the disinterested way the guard waved her through after checking her ID. This building wasn't new to her anymore. It had started to feel familiar, not in a warm way, but in the way that old battlegrounds sometimes become. Familiar because your footprints are still there, even after the dust settles. She was there to file a formal appeal. A stack of meticulously organized documents sat in her tote bag, sections highlighted, citations flagged, the city's procedural errors annotated in the margins like a professor grading a term paper. Her tone wasn't angry. It never was. But there was fire in the way she walked, purpose in the rhythm of her shoes against the polished floor. Behind the long counter of the filing office sat a young man hunched over a keyboard, tapping with a sort of nervous intensity that made him look like he wasn't sure whether he belonged there. He had sandy brown hair that kept falling into his eyes and a tie that looked like it had been tied in a hurry. His nameplate read, D. Howard, Clerk. Karoline waited her turn, watching him handle the woman in front of her, someone trying to get a birth certificate reprinted. He was polite, efficient, but quiet, a little unsure. When it was Karoline's turn, he looked up, and she gave him a small, steady smile. "I'm here to file an appeal," she said. "Case 204, Leavitt versus the City of Kingston." His fingers paused mid-keystroke. "Oh, you're that Karoline Leavitt?" She raised an eyebrow. "There more than one?" He flushed a little and shook his head. No, it's just... people have been talking." "People?" He nodded and lowered his voice. "Staff. A few of the public defenders. Even the judge's clerk. They said you quoted the municipal charter better than some attorneys." Karoline didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched. "I read it thoroughly. Twice." He took her documents and started flipping through them. As he did, the quiet awe on his face shifted to something more focused. He slowed down, began really reading. "You included a citation for King v. New Haven Utility Commission?" "Relevant precedent," Karoline replied. "The ruling established a precedent for citizen commentary in public forums, especially when procedural decisions are made without transparency." He gave a low, impressed whistle. "Most people just show up with a scribbled complaint and ask us to make it go away." "I'm not most people." "No, you're not." He looked up again. "You a law student?" "No." "You? Planning to become one?" Karoline paused. "I've thought about it. But right now, I'm just a citizen making sure the system works the way it's supposed to." The way he looked at her then changed. Not with condescension, not with politeness, with respect. The kind that wasn't handed out easily in places like this. He took a moment longer with the paperwork than necessary, flipping to the last page and checking her signature. "You know," he said, "I'm supposed to log these and pass them to Judge Hargrove's clerk, but he's going to read this himself." Karoline didn't ask how he knew. She already suspected it. As the clerk reached for the official stamp, his sleeve shifted slightly, revealing a tattoo on his inner arm, a line of text in script. She caught a glimpse before he adjusted his sleeve again. "14th Amendment?" she asked. He blinked, startled, then nodded. "You memorized it?" he asked. "I've lived it," she replied. The stamp landed on the top page with a crisp, final thunk. The sound echoed slightly in the quiet office, louder than expected. "Your appeal is accepted," he said. "I'll mark it for expedited review." She gathered her things, gave him a small nod, and turned to leave. But just before she reached the door, he called out, "Miss Leavitt?" She turned. "You ever want to go to law school? I think you'd be terrifying in the best way." Karoline didn't smile, but her eyes did. Because in a place where people often whispered, "She's just a rookie," someone had finally said what she'd known all along. She might not have a degree, but she had something more powerful: the law, and the clarity to use it well. The courthouse cafeteria was not built for conversation. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the coffee tasted vaguely of cardboard, and the food came in plastic containers that made even the most appetizing meal feel like a compromise. But it had chairs, heat, and quiet. Three things Karoline needed that afternoon. She sat at a corner table, her laptop open beside a half-eaten sandwich, papers spread across the table like a makeshift war room. Her fingers moved quickly, typing revisions to her appeal. She was methodical, flagging inconsistencies in the board's timeline, inserting updated language into her argument, cross-referencing case law that even the city clerk probably hadn't reviewed since it was first published. She didn't notice the man watching her from across the room until he cleared his throat. "Mind if I sit?" She looked up, momentarily startled. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a security uniform that matched the courthouse colors, charcoal gray with silver trim. His face was lined, the kind that had seen more late nights and angry voices than he cared to remember. His name tag read, J. Collins. Karoline blinked. "Sure," she said slowly. "Of course." He lowered himself into the seat across from her with a quiet grunt, balancing a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand. "You were in courtroom 2 the other day," he said. Karoline nodded. "Yes. You're the one who quoted the city charter and rattled off 3 Supreme Court cases like you were reading from a teleprompter." A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I've been told." Collins took a sip of his coffee and watched her for a moment. "You're not a lawyer?" "Nope." "You don't work for one either?" "Nope." "Then why go toe-to-toe with a judge like that? Most people get nervous just being in the room." Karoline leaned back slightly, folding her arms. "Because when no one else will say the hard thing, someone has to." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I've worked at this courthouse for 15 years, he said finally. "Seen all kinds come through. Guys in $2,000 suits who can't string a proper sentence together. Kids shaking in their sneakers for a parking ticket. But you—" He trailed off. Karoline raised an eyebrow. "But me?" "You're different," he said. "You didn't argue to win. You argued to make something right. That's rare." She looked at him, unsure of what to say. He took another sip and added, "Judge Hargrove noticed too. He pretends he didn't. But I saw him the next day reading over your transcript in his chambers like it was a puzzle he couldn't solve." Karoline blinked. "He read it again?" "Twice." A beat of silence passed between them. Collins leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, I'm not supposed to get involved. Technically, I'm just security. But I know things. I see who gets waved through and who gets side-eyed. I know who gets heard and who gets dismissed before they even speak." He tapped his fingers against the table, eyes narrowing. "People like you, young, smart, not afraid to speak, you make some folks nervous. They'd rather pretend your questions are troublemaking. It's easier than admitting the answers might be inconvenient." Karoline nodded slowly. She knew the type. She'd met them at council meetings, in school boards, even in classrooms. Collins set his cup down and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "This is the number of a friend of mine," he said. "Used to work civil cases for the state. Retired now, but she still consults when something interesting crosses her desk." Karoline hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" Collins shrugged. "Because somewhere along the line, people forgot the courthouse was built for folks like you. Not just for the ones in robes or ties." She took the paper, unfolding it with care. The handwriting was neat, slightly slanted. "She'll take your call," he added. "Tell her Collins sent you." Karoline tucked the number into her folder, sealing it between legal briefs and photocopied statutes. She didn't say thank you, not because she wasn't grateful, but because she knew he didn't offer it for praise. He offered it because he believed in something too. As Collins stood to leave, he tipped an invisible hat in her direction. "Keep fighting, Miss Leavitt." She nodded. "Always." And as he walked away, Karoline realized something she hadn't expected when this whole thing began. She wasn't alone in this fight. The system might be big, slow, and often blind, but there were people tucked inside it. People like Collins, watching, listening, and, when it mattered most, stepping quietly onto her side. It was nearly dusk when Karoline stepped into the corner cafe across from the courthouse. A quiet place with peeling brick walls, low jazz humming from hidden speakers, and the smell of burnt espresso that somehow still felt comforting. The barista behind the counter offered a distracted nod as Karoline ordered her usual: black coffee, no cream, no sugar, in a mug if they weren't too busy. They weren't. The place was mostly empty, except for a man in a tweed blazer pecking at a laptop and a couple in the corner murmuring over open textbooks. She took her drink to a booth in the back, slid into the worn leather seat, and set her tote bag beside her with a gentle thud. The folder inside it was heavier than it looked, not in weight, but in consequence. Inside were drafts of her appeal, her annotated copy of the city charter, and a list of questions she still planned to submit to the zoning board. But resting on top, printed in thick black ink, was a document she'd begun 2 nights ago under the glow of a desk lamp and the echo of her grandfather's voice in her head. A letter, addressed directly to Judge Walter Hargrove. She hadn't decided yet whether she would send it. That wasn't the point, not entirely. Sometimes writing something was an act of defiance. Other times it was an act of clarity. This one felt like both. She unfolded the letter slowly, rereading it for what felt like the 15th time. Your Honor, I respectfully submit the following observations not in anger or defiance, but in defense of something we both hold dear: the rule of law. Karoline paused at that line every time. It wasn't just the sentence. It was the truth inside it. She didn't hate the judge. She didn't even blame him, not entirely. What she objected to was the shrug of institutional indifference, the way people in power could wield language like a locked door, expecting others to knock politely and wait their turn, even when the house was built on their land. She sipped her coffee, still hot, and stared out the window toward the courthouse. The lights were on in Hargrove's chambers. He was still there. What would he think if he read this? Would he dismiss it as a political stunt? A performance piece by a too-smart-for-her-own-good young woman with a chip on her shoulder? Or would he pause, just for a moment, and ask himself whether the courtroom had truly been fair that day? Karoline didn't know, but she knew what it felt like to walk into a room already presumed to be wrong. She took a pen from her bag and made a few more notes in the margin of the letter. A case citation here, a clarification there. A reminder that this wasn't about winning. It was about remembering who the Constitution was written for. Not the elite. Not the loudest. Not the gatekeepers. Everyone. The bell above the cafe door jingled. A young man entered, drenched from sudden rain, and ordered something sugary with whipped cream. The barista rolled her eyes and disappeared behind the espresso machine. Karoline glanced around the room. No one was watching her. No one saw the way she reread a section of the Constitution that she'd printed and underlined, the ink slightly smudged from where her fingers had held it too long. Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law, abridging the freedom of speech, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. She traced the words with her fingertip. It wasn't just theory, it was instruction. A blueprint for how to speak truth into power, not as a threat, but as a responsibility. Across the street, the light in Hargrove's office flickered off. She watched as his silhouette moved through the window, coat slung over one arm, his figure shrinking as he made his way down the hallway. Maybe he was going home. Maybe he was carrying her case with him in the back of his mind, like a song stuck on repeat. Karoline folded the letter, tucked it back into the folder, and finished her coffee. Tomorrow she will return to the courthouse. Not with protest signs or shouts, but with pages of carefully worded, Constitution-backed clarity. Because conflict didn't always come in the form of raised voices and slammed fists. Sometimes it came in the form of a woman, steady and prepared, walking into the center of a storm with a coffee in one hand and the First Amendment in the other. And sometimes that was more than enough. Judge Walter Hargrove had a ritual every morning, one he rarely deviated from. A single piece of toast, lightly buttered. One egg, over medium. Black coffee in a white mug with a small chip at the rim. And a half hour alone in his study, before the phone rang, before the world came knocking, and before the courtroom demanded his patience and precision. His study was lined with law books, not the digital kind, but the kind with cracked leather spines and notes scribbled in the margins. Volumes he'd carried with him from clerkship to judgeship like old companions. On that particular morning, the toast sat uneaten. The coffee had gone cold, and in front of him sat a file. Case 204, Leavitt. He'd told himself the night before that he was done with it, that it was a routine matter, minor civic disruption, procedural follow-up, end of story. But something about it kept needling him. The kind of needling that didn't come from guilt exactly, but from curiosity. From an awareness that he'd missed something, and that it mattered more than he wanted to admit. He opened the file again, spread the contents across his desk. The officer's citation, the transcript from the zoning board meeting, Karoline Leavitt's original statement, and her recently filed appeal, cleanly typed, meticulously sourced, and sharper than most briefs he saw from full-time counsel. He scanned the pages slowly, pausing to reread the sections she'd highlighted. A clause from the city charter requiring public comment before a vote. A policy from 2003 that mandated accessibility for all residents, regardless of their economic standing or political affiliations. A constitutional reference that had been quoted not with arrogance, but with remarkable fluency. It wasn't just that she had done her homework, it was that she had done his. Judge Hargrove leaned back in his chair and exhaled. He didn't like feeling outmaneuvered, not because of pride, but because it usually meant he hadn't been paying close enough attention. And this young woman, Karoline Leavitt, had done more than just defend herself. She had held a mirror up to the system and asked, "Are you still living up to the principles you claim to protect?" It was a question that landed with more weight than he expected. He stood and walked over to the bookshelves, pulling down a dusty municipal handbook. It had been updated recently, but he liked to start with the original version, see what had changed, what had been quietly amended or quietly ignored. He flipped to the section on public forums and citizen rights, and there it was. A clause nearly identical to the one Karoline had cited. It wasn't obscure. It just wasn't enforced. A small, sharp ache formed behind his temple. Not the physical kind, the ethical kind. He returned to the desk, pulled her appeal closer, and reread her concluding paragraph. The purpose of civil procedure is not to maintain appearances, but to ensure access to fairness. If disruption occurs as a result of exercising one's right to transparency, then perhaps the system is not being disrupted, but exposed. She hadn't written it like a student trying to impress. She had written it like someone who expected to be taken seriously. And now, Hargrove realized, she should have been. He rubbed the back of his neck, then glanced at the handwritten note tucked at the bottom of the file. It wasn't official, just something the courtroom clerk had jotted down in the margins. Composed. Knows the charter by heart. Didn't flinch under pressure. One to watch. He closed the folder gently, then turned to his computer and pulled up the court's case management system. With a few keystrokes, he entered a request for a judicial review. Not because he had to, but because now he wanted to. This wasn't about undoing a mistake. It was about recognizing a moment of clarity disguised as routine. Karoline Leavitt had walked into his courtroom with nothing but a folder and a voice. No credentials, no legal team, no fanfare. And yet, she'd stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. The sense that the law wasn't just a tool for resolving conflict, but a language. A living, breathing language that still had the power to humble those who thought they already knew how the story would end. Judge Hargrove looked out the window. the morning light just beginning to hit the courthouse across the street. He picked up his coffee, took a long sip, and made a note to himself. Reopen the file. She's earned more than a verdict. Then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He opened a fresh legal pad, wrote her name at the top, and began taking notes. Not as a judge preparing a sentence, but as a student, getting ready to learn. By the time the courthouse closed that Thursday evening, her name was no longer just sitting quietly in a case file. It was being whispered down hallways, passed between desks like a secret people weren't quite sure how to handle. Karoline Leavitt. Not a lawyer, not a politician, at least not anymore. Not a staffer, not a clerk, not anything the courthouse had a box for. And yet somehow, in a span of days, she had become the most talked about figure on the docket. Not because of what she wore or how she spoke, but because she had walked into a courtroom designed to keep people in line and had redrawn the line instead. The whispers began in small circles. A junior public defender mentioned her during lunch in the basement cafeteria, nudging her colleague with a forkful of sad chicken salad. Did you hear about the girl who cited Gideon V. Wainwright from memory? Nailed it too. Made the judge blink. Another picked it up in the clerk's office. Filed her own appeal. Flawless formatting. I checked 3 times. She even corrected a case number we got wrong. Soon it spread further. At a nearby law school, one of the adjunct professors passed around a copy of her written appeal during a constitutional law seminar. Not as a novelty, but as a model. This is how you marry clarity with credibility, he told the class. Forget the flowery language. This is precision. This is voice. And by the end of the week, her name showed up in an internal memo from the city solicitor's office. Do not underestimate this individual. She appears to have a comprehensive understanding of municipal law and is not afraid to challenge procedural shortcuts. Respond with care. Who is Karoline Leavitt? That was the question now. A simple Google search answered it halfway. A former congressional candidate, former press secretary, media commentator, political lightning rod, depending on who you asked. But what the internet didn't show was the version of Karoline walking the courthouse steps now. Not the polished persona on TV, not the strategist from campaign war rooms, not the talking head on a split screen between 2 pundits yelling over each other. This Karoline was quieter, sharper, more dangerous, in the way clarity always is. She didn't need a microphone anymore. She had a folder full of evidence, a letter stamped and filed, and a growing list of people watching her, not as a curiosity, but as a presence. And Judge Hargrove? He was watching too. Late that night, in the stillness of his den, he sat by the fireplace with her case open in his lap. The flames crackled softly, but the room was otherwise silent. His wife had long since gone to bed. The house was dark except for the golden flicker of light dancing across the old wood floor. He wasn't just reading now, he was studying. Her footnotes cited not only federal rulings, but obscure municipal ordinances, local bylaws buried under years of political dust. She didn't just know her argument, she knew theirs. She anticipated the rebuttals, built around them, and arrived at a place where her case wasn't just persuasive. It was correct. Who is Karoline Leavitt? He remembered the way she'd stood in court, unimpressed by power, unmoved by his title. Not disrespectful, just unimpressed. Like someone who had already learned that systems are only as strong as the people holding them accountable. She reminded him of someone. Not a student, not a lawyer, a mirror. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. In another corner of the city, a journalist who covered City Hall had received a tip. You should look into the Leavitt case, the message read. Something unusual is happening. She's not filing for attention. She's filing like someone who knows exactly where to aim. He jotted the name down, made a few calls, pulled her file from the public records archive. By midnight, he had a headline scribbled in a notebook. The woman who out-argued City Hall, with a copy of the Constitution and a $3 pen. The city wasn't ready for her. Not because she was brash, not because she was loud, but because she knew too much to ignore and believed too deeply to stop. That's who Karoline Leavitt was. And the more they tried to fit her into a box, the more she reminded them that some voices don't wait to be invited in. They just speak, and the whole room shifts. By the time the hearing date was set, the courthouse had shifted. Not physically, not in its walls or paint or floors, but in something harder to name, something deeper. People walked differently through the halls. Clerks double-checked forms they used to stamp blindly. Even Judge Hargrove's steps had taken on a quiet weight, as though the air itself had grown more aware of who might be listening. Because the Leavitt case, what had started as a $100 fine for an alleged procedural disruption, was no longer just a footnote. It was something else now. A question, a challenge, a line in the sand. Karoline arrived early that morning. She didn't rush. She never did. She wore the same navy blazer, the same calm expression, the same steady walk that had carried her through the first time. But the difference was in the way people looked at her now. Not as a name on a docket, not as a girl with a folder and a point to make. Now they looked at her like someone worth watching. She didn't crave attention. She didn't even particularly enjoy it, but she knew it came with the territory. Truth had a habit of turning heads, especially when it came dressed not in protest or anger, but in logic, civility, and receipts. The courtroom was fuller than usual for a civil matter. A few law students filled the back row. One local journalist took notes on a legal pad, old school style. There were attorneys who didn't have cases on the docket but showed up anyway, to observe, to learn, or maybe just to say they were in the room when it happened. Judge Hargrove entered with his usual composure, but Karoline noticed it, the slight hesitation before he sat, the moment he looked her way and didn't look away quite so fast. The hearing wasn't long, 38 minutes to be exact, but it didn't need to be. Karoline presented her case with the same clarity that had brought her this far. She didn't rehearse it like a performance. She didn't try to overwhelm with jargon or drama. She spoke plainly, factually, boldly. The board failed to follow the public comment requirements stated in Article 4, Section 12 of the Municipal Charter, she said. I exercised my right to ask for clarity before a vote that would impact my neighborhood and others like it. For that, I was removed and fined. She paused, letting the words settle. This is not about that $100. This is about what happens when we normalize silencing voices under the guise of procedure. It's about whether we, as citizens, still have standing in the rooms where decisions are made about us. The city attorney responded, of course, cited decorum, order, the need for predictability in public forums. But even as he spoke, there was a growing sense in the room that something bigger was playing out. This wasn't a routine appeal anymore. It was a referendum. When it came time for the judge to speak, the room went still. Judge Hargrove didn't rush. He removed his glasses, folded his hands, and looked directly at Karoline. I've reviewed the appeal. I've reviewed the transcript. And I've reviewed the charter. Twice, he said, a faint note of something like humility in his voice. He turned slightly, addressing the room, not just the plaintiff. There is an important distinction between disruption and dissent. The former undermines the process. The latter is the heartbeat of it. Then he turned back to her. You were correct, Miss Leavitt. In fact, in the law, and in your insistence that this chamber is not above its own rules." A hush fell. "I am vacating the fine," he said, "and I will be issuing a formal recommendation to the City Council to review and revise public comment procedures to reflect the clarity and enforcement they currently lack." Karoline nodded once. No smile, no fist pump, just the quiet composure of someone who had expected nothing, but prepared for everything. Outside the courthouse, the journalists scribbled notes furiously. The students whispered, and the city attorney packed up in silence. But Karoline? She simply walked out the way she came in, with nothing but a folder, a purpose, and the echo of a courtroom that had, for once, listened. It wasn't about the ruling, it was about the precedent. Because now the city knew. You can't fine away the truth. And you definitely can't silence a voice that knows exactly where the Constitution lives. Line by line, right between courage and clarity. Another day in court, this time around, they came early. An hour before the doors opened, a quiet line had already formed outside the courthouse, longer than anyone expected for a zoning case. It started with law students, notebooks in hand, muttering Latin phrases and betting on procedural outcomes. Then came the reporters, first local, then regional. Someone said a national outlet had sent a freelancer just in case the story turned. And tucked among the crowd were ordinary citizens, neighbors, teachers, city workers, people who didn't know Karoline Leavitt personally, but knew what she'd done. Or rather, what she refused to let go quietly. Inside, security was tight but not hostile. The guards didn't scowl, they nodded. One even offered Karoline a quiet "good luck" as she passed through the metal detector. She nodded back. No smile, not yet. Judge Hargrove's courtroom had never been this full for anything short of a high-profile trial. But today, it was standing room only. Court staff scrambled to bring in extra chairs. The clerk reminded people to silence their phones. The bailiff, normally lax with posture, stood rigid by the door. This wasn't just a hearing anymore, it was a moment. Karoline sat alone at the defendant's table, though no one called her that now. Not out loud. She wore black slacks, a slate-gray blazer, and a single silver pin her grandfather once gave her. A quiet nod to where it all started. Her notes were stacked neatly in front of her, the same way they had been every time before. No legal team, no entourage, just her. Across the aisle, the city's attorney flipped through a thick binder, lips pressed thin, jaw working overtime. He'd come prepared for a routine hearing, months ago. Today, he came dressed like someone trying not to lose a war in front of cameras. At precisely 10 o'clock a.m., the door shut and the room settled. Judge Hargrove entered without announcement. He didn't look to the crowd. His eyes went directly to Karoline. "This court is now in session," he said. It began with a motion, a request by the city to dismiss the appeal on the grounds that the fine, already vacated, rendered the case moot. Karoline stood. "Respectfully, Your Honor, vacating the fine didn't vacate the precedent," she said. "The public deserves clarification, not silence." Hargrove gave the city attorney a glance. "She has a point." The city pushed back. Of course they did. They cited policy, precedent, the need for order and brevity in public hearings. But for every point they raised, Karoline countered. Not with volume, not with flair, but with calm precision. She cited the Charter again, the state's open meeting law, the First Amendment, case after case, policy after policy, each one landing like the deliberate strikes of someone who knew she wasn't trying to win an argument, she was trying to protect something. 34 minutes into the hearing, someone in the gallery stood up and left, visibly shaken. It wasn't boredom. It was discomfort. Not with her tone, with her truth. Halfway through, a member of the city council slipped into the back row. Then another. Whispers grew. People took notes. Some just stared, watching as Karoline, without blinking, held the room. The city attorney grew more defensive. "She's not a lawyer," he snapped at one point. "She doesn't have to be," Hargrove replied, his tone dry. "She's a citizen. This chamber belongs to her, too." You could feel it then. The shift. The moment when the crowd, the bench, even the walls of the room recognized what was happening. Karoline wasn't appealing a fine anymore. She was redrawing the map. By the time closing statements were offered, the room was silent. The kind of silence that only shows up when people are witnessing something they know will be remembered. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just undeniable. Karoline's last words were barely above a whisper. "All I'm asking for is what the law already promised." She sat, and no one moved for a long moment. When Judge Hargrove finally rose to deliver his statement, his voice was steady but not cold. "This hearing may be about a zoning violation, but what it represents is much larger," he said. "Today, we've been reminded of the civic weight each citizen carries, not when they hold office, but when they hold truth and choose to speak it." He ruled in her favor. But that wasn't the headline. The headline was the way she stood, the way she spoke, the way she refused to shrink. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones angled, questions flew. Karoline stepped into the light, raised her hand gently, and said only this: "I didn't come here to be the story. I came here to remind the story who it belongs to." And just like that, she turned and walked away. The cameras followed, but the moment stayed in the room. Because years from now, when people talk about the day a young woman walked into court and changed the way a city listens, they'll say, "I was there," and they'll mean it. The headlines came fast. Faster than Karoline expected, faster than the courthouse could adjust, faster than anyone in the city's legal department could spin a response. The story leapt from blogs and local papers to national outlets within 48 hours, bouncing between headlines that couldn't decide whether they were amazed or annoyed. Former staffer school city in open court. She brought notes. The judge brought regret. Karoline Leavitt, legal genius or just someone who read the fine print? It didn't matter that she wasn't a lawyer. Not anymore. By the time the Sunday morning talk shows rolled around, she was the one being quoted. Her statements played back over graphics of the Constitution and dramatic cello music. She'd become, somehow, the embodiment of every quiet person who had ever raised their hand in a meeting and been ignored. Of every community member who had stood at a microphone only to be thanked, smiled at, and forgotten. But none of it had been the plan. Karoline didn't care for fame. She never had. In fact, she found it exhausting, messy, and too often built on half-truths. She liked precision, order, knowing what something meant and where it belonged. And now, people were trying to decide where she belonged. Legal genius? That wasn't a title she had asked for. She'd been trained in messaging, not litigation. Her degrees were in political science and communication. She'd written statements for lawmakers, not case law for courtrooms. But something about the way she approached the hearing had struck a chord. Maybe because she hadn't come in swinging like a career lawyer. She'd come in armed with facts, clarity, and the quiet, relentless insistence that the system had to answer to its own promises. The legal community split in two. Some dismissed her as an activist with a flair for theatrics. Others, especially younger attorneys, called her a phenomenon. A law professor from Yale tweeted, "Karoline Leavitt just gave the country a masterclass in civic participation. Her knowledge of procedural law is no fluke. It's studied, deliberate, and sharp. She doesn't need a JD to understand the law. She just needs the truth on her side. That tweet alone got over 1 million views. Meanwhile, the city scrambled. Internal emails leaked, meetings were called. Someone floated the idea of revising the public comment policy. Another proposed a special task force on procedural transparency. It was, as one council member quietly put it, the most civil panic we've ever had. And through it all, Karoline stayed mostly silent. She didn't go on a press tour. She didn't accept speaking gigs or book deals. When one major cable network offered her a primetime interview, she politely declined. "This isn't a brand," she told them. "It's a moment. Let's not dilute it." Still, the question echoed. Was she just incredibly prepared? Or was she something else entirely? Judge Hargrove was asked that very thing when cornered outside a Chamber of Commerce luncheon. "She's one of the most compelling litigants I've ever heard," he said, adjusting his tie. "And she's not even a litigator." "Is she a genius?" the reporter pressed. Hargrove paused, thought, then said, "She's dangerous, in the best way, because she reminds us all how fragile power really is when it's not rooted in accountability." That quote made the front page. And Karoline? She read it alone in a cafe the next morning, sipping her coffee, eyebrows raised just slightly. She folded the paper and tucked it into her bag, not for vanity, but for record-keeping. For the same reason she kept old counsel transcripts and bookmarked court rulings, because details mattered. She didn't think of herself as a genius, not even close. She thought of herself as a citizen who had refused to be dismissed. A woman raised by debate and grit, armed with her grandfather's lessons and a belief that knowing the rules wasn't enough. You had to know when to invoke them, and how to do it with the kind of clarity that made people lean forward instead of walk away. Genius? Maybe. Maybe not. But as one retired judge later put it in an op-ed, every few decades, someone walks into a courtroom and reminds the system that it answers to the people. Karoline Leavitt didn't just win her case. She reminded the rest of us what the law is supposed to sound like when spoken without fear. That, Karoline thought, as she closed her laptop that night, was the only verdict that mattered. The envelope was thick, off-white, and unmistakably official. No return address on the front, just her name typed in clean serif font. Karoline Leavitt. The postmark read City Courthouse, and the corner bore the subtle imprint of the municipal seal. Karoline found it tucked between a grocery flyer and an electric bill, as ordinary as any piece of mail. She carried it inside, placed it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it for a long moment. The air was still. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum a little quieter. She knew the handwriting. She knew the weight. She waited a full 10 minutes before opening it. When she did, she used a butter knife, slowly, carefully, as if the wrong angle might ruin whatever it contained. The letter inside was on heavyweight stationery, folded twice. No smudges, no rushed penmanship. Just that same studied, deliberate elegance that defined Judge Walter Hargrove. She read it standing up, then read it again, seated. Then once more, aloud, to no one but the quiet room. Dear Miss Leavitt, I have thought a great deal about whether or not to write this. Judges are not in the habit of sending personal letters to those who appear in their courtrooms, nor should they be. The robe, after all, is meant to stand between person and position, between opinion and responsibility. But every so often, a case comes along that warrants something more than a ruling. Yours did. I would like to begin by offering something rare from the bench. An apology. Not for the verdict. I stand by the reversal, and the recommendation to reform procedure is already in motion. But for the initial assumptions I carried into that courtroom when your name first appeared on my docket. I saw a young woman with no legal representation and presumed the case would be a formality. I expected frustration, possibly defiance. I did not expect constitutional clarity. I did not expect case law. I did not expect a defense so cleanly built, it rivaled the best briefs I've seen from seasoned attorneys. But more than the arguments you made, what struck me was the way you made them. Calm, focused, without grandstanding. You never once raised your voice. And yet you managed to shake the foundation of a system that, too often, grows lazy in its power. You reminded us all, myself included, that the law does not belong solely to the lawyers. It belongs to the public. And the moment it becomes so tangled in process that it can no longer be accessed by the people it claims to protect, it ceases to be just. I have since read more of your work, your filings, your letters, your footnotes. You have a mind made for this kind of thinking, and a voice uniquely suited to challenging what needs to be challenged, not for attention, but for improvement. I do not know what your plans are, nor do I presume to tell you what they should be, but I hope sincerely that you will continue to make yourself heard, not just in courtrooms, but in classrooms, communities, and places where laws are written, not just interpreted. You have my respect, Miss Leavitt, and if I may offer it, my encouragement. Sincerely, Judge Walter Hargrove. Karoline sat in silence for a long while, the letter resting on the table in front of her like a bridge between two very different versions of her life, before the hearing and after. It wasn't praise that moved her. It was the shift behind it. Judges didn't write letters, not like this. Not unless something had broken through the procedural wall, something undeniable, something that made even the most seasoned officials step back and ask themselves, have I forgotten who I serve? Karoline folded the letter slowly, carefully. She slid it back into the envelope and tucked it inside a file labeled Case 204, now thicker than most small-town law libraries. But she wasn't collecting victories. She was collecting reminders. That truth, spoken clearly and without apology, had the power to reach anyone, even those seated behind the tallest desks. Later that night, as rain tapped against the window panes and steam curled from a fresh cup of coffee, Karoline opened her laptop and typed just 3 words into a blank document. Dear Judge Hargrove. Because some letters are meant to start something, not end it. She never planned to become a symbol. That kind of thing usually happens to people by accident, when a moment brushes up against the right pair of eyes, or when an ordinary fight turns out to be more than anyone realized. And that's what happened to Karoline Leavitt. She didn't campaign for it. She didn't hold a press conference. She just walked into a courtroom with the facts and a spine, and something in the atmosphere shifted. Now, 2 weeks after her hearing, the shift had a pulse. The emails started as trickles. A teacher from Ohio who'd been silenced at a school board meeting. A nurse from Texas fined for speaking out at a city planning session. A firefighter's wife in Arizona who was escorted out of a town hall because she'd spoken out of turn during the public comment period. They weren't dramatic stories. No arrests, no headlines, no protests. But each one had the same quiet echo. I thought I had a right to speak. Turns out I didn't. Or maybe I did, and no one cared. Karoline read every word. At first, she just replied with encouragement. Sometimes she sent them links to the cases she'd cited in her own appeal. Other times, she pointed them to local ordinances they could quote. But soon the questions got deeper, more complex. People didn't just want encouragement, they wanted guidance. And something more subtle. They wanted someone who would say, "You're not wrong to expect better." So she started organizing her notes, turning what had once been scribbled in the margins of her appeal into clean, structured templates. How to challenge a procedural fine. how to file a motion to speak at a public meeting, how to cite your local charter when the officials pretend you haven't read it. The work wasn't glamorous. There were no cameras now, no courtroom tension, just Karoline at her desk, cross-referencing municipal codes and folding case law into language anyone could use. The kind of language her grandfather once used at their kitchen table. Plain, clear, built for people who don't wear suits to City Hall. What started as a folder on her desktop grew into something more. A project, a resource hub. A growing list of regular citizens who wanted what she wanted, to be heard without having to shout, to be respected without having to ask twice. She didn't call it a movement. That word had been drained by headlines and hashtags. But something was happening. Something real. By the third week, her inbox had over 400 messages. Dozens from people who were trying to show up for their neighborhoods, only to be shut down by process dressed up as policy. Karoline responded to them one by one. And then, in a small library basement in Manchester, she agreed to speak. It wasn't a speech exactly. No script, no teleprompter. Just 30 people in metal chairs, legal pads on their laps, and the same question hanging in the air. How do we keep them from closing the doors on us again? Karoline answered the way she always had. Methodically, quietly, with clarity sharpened by conviction. Start with your charter, she said. Know what it promises. Memorize the sections about participation. Because once you know the rules, they can't pretend you don't belong. Someone asked her if she planned to run for office again. The question floated for a moment before she answered. Maybe someday, she said. But right now, I'm more interested in making sure the people who already vote, speak, and show up don't get turned away at the door. There was no applause, just a few quiet nods. And that was enough. Back at home, Karoline printed a new header for her files. Not defendant, not petitioner, just two simple words, civic defender. She didn't need a law degree, or a title, or a nameplate on an office door. She had something better, the knowledge that when ordinary people understood the rules of the system, they didn't just participate in it, they changed it. And she would be there, one case, one charter, one question at a time, to help them do exactly that. The library was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over a room with purpose. Not hush your voice quiet. Something deeper, intentional. Like everyone inside had agreed, without saying a word, that they were here for something more than books. Karoline stood near the front, not behind a podium. She hated those. But just in front of a folding table stacked with municipal codes, pocket constitutions, and a few copies of her original court filings, now neatly bound in blue folders. 30 chairs had been set out. 50 people came. Some stood in the back. Others leaned against shelves marked local history and politics. No one checked their phone. No one left early. A woman in the front row, a retired postmaster named Ellen, had raised her hand with a question that wasn't really a question. When did it get so complicated to just ask for a straight answer from our own government? Karoline nodded slowly. It's not supposed to be. That's the problem. She didn't have a slideshow. No dramatic graphics, just her voice, a few markers, and a whiteboard someone had wheeled in from the children's room. And yet, as she spoke, the room leaned in. Not because she was performing, but because she wasn't. She was just telling the truth. The law isn't some sacred scroll locked away in a marble tower, she said, her voice steady. It's public. It's printed. It's yours. People scribbled notes. A man with a carpenter's hands nodded along with a pencil tucked behind his ear. A high school student recorded everything on a borrowed tablet, eyes wide like he'd stumbled into a secret map nobody told him existed. Karoline flipped open a copy of her city's charter. You want to know what power sounds like? It sounds like knowing exactly where to point when someone says, "That's not how it works." She read a line aloud. Section 3, Article 9. The public shall be granted reasonable opportunity to be heard on matters of direct civic impact during any regular session. Then she looked up. Every time someone says, "We'll take that under advisement," and moves on without letting you finish your sentence, this sentence right here says otherwise. A woman near the back raised her hand. But what if they ignore it anyway? Karoline didn't hesitate. Then you don't leave the room quietly. You file a request. You quote their own rules back to them. And if they still ignore you, you make a record. Because the thing about records is, they're harder to erase than people think. She paused, then added, "And if you don't know how to do that yet, I'll show you." That's what set her apart. Not just the way she had fought for herself, but the way she had turned her fight into a toolkit for others. She didn't want applause. She wanted replication. After the workshop, people stayed. They asked questions in clumps, told their stories. A veteran who'd been blocked from testifying at a town hall about the condition of local housing for former service members. A substitute teacher who'd been fined for distributing a flyer with school board meeting times. A single mom who just wanted to know how to read a budget line item without needing a law degree. Karoline answered each one, patiently, not with condescension, but with recognition. Because once, not long ago, she'd been the one asking the questions. She packed up quietly when the last of them left. The whiteboard was covered now. Bullet points, arrows, citations scrawled in her careful handwriting. At the bottom, someone had written in blue marker, "The law belongs to everyone, KL." She hadn't said it exactly like that, but it was close enough. As she stepped into the night air, the wind tugged at the edges of her coat. The city was quieter now, but not asleep. Not anymore. She could feel it. She walked past the courthouse on her way home. Its windows were dark, the marble cold under the streetlights. But she didn't see a fortress anymore. She saw a house. And houses, she knew, belonged to the people inside them. A year from now, maybe 10, someone would stand where she once stood. Not famous, not loud, but prepared. They'd hold up a folded piece of paper, charter, ordinance, clause, and say, "I think you've forgotten what this says." And whoever tried to wave them off would pause, just for a second. Because someone, somewhere, had reminded them. The law doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to all of us. And the door stays open. The rain had started again, soft this time, more like a hush than a storm, as Karoline stood by the window, watching the streetlights reflect off the pavement below. She held a warm mug between her hands, the steam curling upward like a quiet exhale. A year ago, she'd been a name buried in a case file, a line item in a courtroom schedule, just another person showing up, asking a system to listen. Now, people she'd never met were quoting her in town halls and council meetings. Students were writing essays about her hearing. A podcast had even done an episode titled "The Woman Who Made the Law Blink." And yet, she hadn't changed. Not really. She still preferred small rooms to big stages. Still wrote her notes by hand before typing them. Still believed that clarity mattered more than credentials. People asked her sometimes, what was the moment that changed everything? She'd smile and answer honestly. It wasn't the judge's letter, or the headlines, or even the hearing. It was the moment she realized the system wasn't broken. It was just hoping someone would hold it accountable. That anyone could. That everyone should. And maybe that was the real legacy. Not the fine she got reversed. Not the reforms that followed. But the door she pushed open. One careful, steady step at a time. So that others could walk through without having to raise their voice just to be heard. Because power doesn't always look like shouting into microphones or storming down marble halls. Sometimes it looks like a young woman standing alone in court with a folder, a copy of the Constitution, and an unshakable belief that the law is only worth following if it remembers who it's supposed to protect. So the next time you feel small in a room built to make you feel that way, remember Karoline. And remember this: you don't need permission to be right. You don't need a title to ask the hard questions, and you don't need a degree to defend your place in the story. Just show up, be prepared, and speak. Because when you do, even the judge listens. Thanks for watching. If Karoline's story reminded you of a time you stood up for something, no matter how small, drop it in the comments. You never know who needs the encouragement. And if this inspired you, be sure to hit that like button so it reaches more people who might just be one quiet push away from holding the system accountable too. Don't also forget to check out the video appearing on your screen right now for another inspiring story that will brighten your day.